Scott Segrist again. Now we're going to do the second part of the lecture on Hobbes. I said last in the first video that I was going to I was going to just talk about the political theory proper in the Leviathan, meaning to cover the foundations of the political theory in the part of the theory of the Leviathan in the first video, but I forgot to do that. So we're going to cover them both in this one. So let's start with this, where really almost all of the theorists up until very recent times start. It's with the question of human nature. I say until recent times, people have started to question whether there is such a thing as human nature that is identifiable. And to the extent you can't say that there is, this leads to serious epistemological issues, which we won't go into here. But Hobbes assumes there is a human nature, and he also assumes that it's fixed. And this is how he thinks it works. First, our sensations, physical sensations, are the source of all our thoughts and actions. And these sensations are caused by external objects. This is determinism. Right? Our thoughts and actions are caused by external objects. And this leaves the idea, or this is the foundation for the idea, that people's thought and behavior can be conditioned as desired by external arrangements made by the state. Then there are the passions, which Hobbes calls the springs of voluntary motion. People are fundamentally driven by passions, and the passions generally can be boiled down to two foundational passions, which is appetite and aversion. Right? Things that you want and things that you want to avoid. Right? Will, Hobbes says, is merely the last passion. And this is determinism, right? And it's a corollary of his materialism. Then there's the important concept of power. Hobbes defines this as a present means to obtain some future apparent good. In other words, something desired. And since power is necessary to get what you want, for all human beings, we are fundamentally driven by, quote, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. So here's the progression, right? You need power to get what you want, right? What you want is determined by passions, which are determined by sensations, which come from external objects. That's the line of deterministic causation. But it's this restless quest for power after power that makes human beings dangerous to each other. And in relation to other human beings, the drive for power takes the form of a drive for self-preservation. And this drive for self-preservation is going to be foundational for Hobbes' political theory. It will depend on that form of the quest for power. And then with regard to reason, Hobbes defines reason as, quote, reckoning consequences of general names agreed on. So contrast these definitions of these elements of human nature with the classical Christian view. Okay, take the inclinations first. Hobbes kind of boils it down to self-preservation. Uh, Thomas Aquinas had said that is a fundamental human drive, the drive for self-preservation. But there are different drives. In fact, higher drives, higher in value, uh, that are different in kind. We also have an inclination to want to care for our young and to gravitate towards creatures of our own kind and so forth. And then above that, there's the inclination to be involved in a rational community, a community of meaning. But Hobbes says no, that all of that stuff, it boils down really to self-preservation. On the question of will, Hobbes rejects explicitly, very explicitly, rejects free will. And you compare that to Augustine. So Augustine had also said that the will is a product of love. But Augustine defined will as assenting or dissenting from desires, which implies a choice. I could have gone one way or the other, and I went this way. And you know which way you're supposed to go by getting the right objects of desire in mind and directing them to the right objects. All of this implies a deliberate move, right? None of that is there for Hobbes. In terms of knowledge, Hobbes said it's all based on physical sensation. But the ancients, Plato, for example, thought that spiritual knowledge is not only possible, but it's more substantive, it's more real, it's more certain even than knowledge of the material world. You can get a sense of what that means by studying Plato's divided line image in Book 6 of the Republic. And then reason for the ancients. Hobbes defines it as this calculating, reckoning faculty. But the ancients thought that calculating dimension of reason, or the logical dimension connecting points A to B and B to C, that logic, or reasoning as we might say, is only a secondary form of reason. It's secondary and dependent upon a higher form of reason that is kind of intuitive, that intuitively grasps principles. And ultimately, they all saw, the ancients, the ones we've talked about, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, understood reason as ultimately an orientation towards the divine source of existence and order. That's what reason was. So this is a radically different notion of reason. We moderns sort of have become so familiar, so accustomed to understanding reason in something more like Hobbes' terms that we was taken aback by the notion of reason of the ancients. But again, this is something you'll have to sort out in your own readings. On the question of truth and science, Hobbes says truth consists of the right ordering of names and affirmations. Okay, so the right ordering may connect directly to reality in terms of the introspection of you see these internal sensations and passions and so forth as you look within. But there's an element of what you could call nominalism here. Right? He said reason is a reckoning of names. How do you put that? A reckoning of the consequences of names agreed on. This looks a lot like nominalism. That is to say, truth is based on terminology as opposed to really an ability to understand reality as such. So this is so the modern version of this is discourse theory, where we can't understand. All of our thinking about reality is shaped by the language we use. We think in language. We think in terms that we have inherited, and so we can't. There's no sort of pure vision of reality. It's all so. So really, what we need to understand is the terms and the relation between the terms. Hobbes' notion of science, knowledge of is the knowledge of consequences, right? Of material causes and effects. But because truth is a kind of matter of agreement, or a right ordering of names, and not everybody is as good of a calculator as Hobbes, for example. There will always be controversies about the truth. So that Hobbes says, ultimately, to settle science, if you will, you need an arbitrator or judge. There has to be somebody that people will turn to decide the question for them. This is a very important idea in relation to his politics. It contrasts all this, again, with the classical Christian view. Truth to the ancients was knowledge of the structure of reality and our place in it. Science, they understood as knowledge of ultimate causes, which they understood Aristotle's a special case in some respects, but they're not understood as material causes. It wasn't. It related to the question of, okay, what caused that material cause, and what caused the material cause before that? And if you push it back far enough, where did the first material come from? Then you're getting at ultimate causes. It reminds me of the Schelling. At least he was one of the people who said that the two most fundamental philosophical questions. I hope you're listening, taking notes. The first question is, why is there something rather than nothing? The second one is, why is the something what it is and not something else? That gets you to ultimate causes, or that gets you to wrestling with ultimate causes. That kind of thing is typically bracketed by modern thinkers. And then in the classical Christian view, their attitude towards disagreement was a little different. Both the classics and the Christians thought that mere disagreement did not necessarily imply an inaccessibility of truth. That you can't assume that truth is unknowable by the fact that people disagree about it. Some of them might actually be right. I mean, some of them might see the truth and others don't. So there's not all opinions are equal. Not all of them are equally correct. Some of them are based on more experience than others. Some of them are come to by people who think things through more carefully, and so on. Agreement really has nothing to do with truth in some respects. And there was also a greater acceptance, at least of the earlier Christians, of mystery, the classics too. They're just things we don't know. You can't nail down certain things. And when that is the case, you shouldn't try to. You shouldn't force the issue. This does sort of, they part ways, the classics and the Christians, after a certain time. I mean, Socrates, when most of Socrates' dialogues, actually Plato's dialogues, end with what's called aporia, Aporia, which means basically inconclusive. We've clarified the question, we've maybe made some progress, but ultimately we can't settle on a definite answer. So that kind of tentativeness was always retained by Plato and Aristotle. In the Christian Church, you had a process of doctrinalization which tried to close off a debate to some degree. It was in response to kind of chaos of radically different opinions about what Christianity meant, and so may have been some real necessity of trying to define things and sort of establish some boundaries that way. But there are different approaches to disagreement. That is my point. In terms of political science and the human good, Hobbes is a value-free science, as I've noted. Right? He says he avoids value-laden terms. They're not to be trusted. They're not solid grounds for reasoning. So, like Machiavelli, he aims at the effectual truth. What works in material terms? Efficient causation. Then Hobbes defines good and evil. The good is whatever you want, and that's what you call good, whatever you want, and evil is whatever you want to avoid. So it's entirely relative to passions, and it's different for everybody else. So there's no objective good and evil, right and wrong, so forth. And there's no ultimate good. You'd have to know the ultimate good, I guess, to determine these things. He at some point explicitly says there is no summum bonum, which was the Latin term for the greatest good, the ultimate good, the most complete good, objectively defined. There is no such thing. There's only a summum malum. This is, I don't know if I'll touch on it later, so I'll just bring it up here. In relation to the question of how to come up with some solid foundation for political society, Hobbes suggests that people will never agree on what is best and what the good is. And therefore, there can be no common good. But people might be able to agree on something they all don't like. And one of those is violent death. And so it's something you can work with in terms of trying to establish some kind of agreement. So this is what caused Leo Strauss to call the modern foundation of politics low but solid. Then happiness, Hobbes defines as success in obtaining whatever things you desire. So comparing that with the ancients. For the ancients, the whole point of political science is to determine objective values and what is objectively good, what provides true happiness. There is a true happiness, they thought, for societies. That's the whole point of political science, they thought. They thought objective value can be determined by awareness of a transcendent ultimate good. And they thought that knowing that ultimate good is the basis of happiness, or the highest form of happiness. So you see radical differences going down to the very foundations between uh, Hobbes and the ancients. Last point on building up to the political theory proper uh, with regard to statecraft. So the aim of statecraft is eliminating public conflict. It's not achieving justice in some kind of higher sense. We'll look at his definition of justice later. It's eliminating public conflict. Aristotle said that the virtue of a statesman is prudence, and he defined that as the knowing how to apply universal principles to particular circumstances. It took a special kind of judgment to do that, and that was prudence. Not so for Hobbes. Like with Machiavelli, prudence is a matter of anticipating the results of actions. Right? And then, so the activity of statecraft, for Hobbes, you could say, is conditioning people to abide by a certain plan for the state. Condition people through education and discipline, as he puts it in the conclusion, eliminating conflict by giving the state final authority and power to settle disagreements of all kinds, and crushing disturbers of the peace. Again, Hobbes's understanding of human knowledge, human will, and so forth is it's all determined by external factors, right? And so this notion that, well, what the state has to do is create the kind of circumstances that will bring about the results we want, kind of external circumstances, and then things will all work out. Okay, so to the political theory proper. The most critical chapters in some ways are chapters 13, 14, and 15 of the book. Chapter 13 talks about the natural condition of mankind, which is the same thing that Locke called the state of nature. It's that term, the state of nature, that has stuck. But the state of nature is simply the condition of human beings when there is no common power over them with sufficient enforcement power to keep the peace. Note, man is not a political animal again. The natural state of man is this situation without a political society. In this state of nature, human beings are equal. People are naturally equal. And for Hobbes, this means they're equal in the power of body and mind, and equal in their insecurity, in their vulnerability to violent death. Not a very high notion of equality, but that's it. So you see in the description, some people are stronger than others, but then there may be someone who can outwit them, right? Smarter. But no one's so smart they can anticipate every scenario where people might try to gang up on them and everything. So ultimately, in a state of nature, none of us is secure. Our safety is not secured, right? And all this talk about safety and violence is because people naturally are always seeking power after power. They're dangerous to each other for that reason. And so this is, Hobbes calls it a state of war. The state of nature is a state of war, of every man against every man, as he puts it, right? And war he defines as not just what we call hot war, but a cold war, uh, a situation where there's a tendency towards conflict and violence in the sense that everybody's arming themselves against each other in anticipation that they might be harmed, right? And this whole scenario um, is a state of war. Um, some people said this comes up with Locke too, and Rousseau. Um, an objection, and this was an objection that maybe somebody, an Aristotelian, might make, is is there ever been a state of nature? Haven't human beings always lived in societies that always had some kind of political organization of one kind or another? And is there even such a state? Isn't this just a thought experiment? And Hobbes suggests, well, there are two cases where it actually exists. One is in America. He's talking about the New World, which is, from the European perspective, wild and untamed, right? Um, and you could understand a tribal society as pre-political, depending on how you define political. Um, and maybe by Hobbes' definition, it would have been pre-political, even if you understood, you know, tribal life in America. But that's one in America, but also in a case of civil war. In a case of civil war, you have a state of nature of the kind he's talking about. It's anarchy. Nobody feels safe. Uh, and life in a state of nature, he says, is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Terrible place. And he hints later in the conclusion of the book, at least there's a taste of the idea that state of nature also may be actually existing in terms of the relationship between nation states. They're in a state of nature in relation to each other that works in a similar way as he's saying that individuals in a state of nature operate in relation to each other in this state of nature that he's talking about here. It's critical that in this state of nature, for Hobbes, there is no such thing as justice. There is no natural justice. There is no higher law. It's it's the law of it's the law of survival. It's the law of self-preservation. It's the only law. Law of the jungle, you might say. But in this situation, so this is not tenable. We can't stay here. This is horrible. This is there's nothing good is secure in this environment of chaos and violence. So how do we get out of it? Well, we're driven by our passions first of all, our fear for our security, and our hope that maybe we could get out of it if we put our minds to it, and that's where reason comes in. Reason recognizes the requirements of peace, what would be necessary to do to get out of this state of war in the state of nature, and that leads into the laws of nature. But first, I've got to define those terms. So, the related terms. Hobbes says that he defines here a right of nature, or what sometimes called natural right, liberty, and the law of nature. And you can note, you should note, that his definitions for these things are radical redefinitions of the old concepts. The ancients used these same terms, natural right or right by nature, as Plato and Aristotle put it. natural law, to use Cicero and Aquinas' terms, right? But Hobbes' definition of things, these things mean to Hobbes um, almost exactly the opposite of what they mean um, for the ancients. It's always a nice technique if you can take old terms that are generally people are comfortable with, and you can give them new meaning. Well, then you may have a better chance of winning people over to a radical new vision. Anyway, so the right of nature, um, Hobbes says, is uh, the liberty to do whatever it takes um, for your self-preservation. And this means anything. I mean, uh, slaughtering, masses of people, enslaving peoples, and whatnot. Whatever it takes, that's the right of nature. It's exactly the opposite of right in the classic sense. Um, well, what is liberty then? Liberty is the power to do what you want unimpeded by material obstacles. Right? It was not some kind of spiritual liberty, or something like what comes with the ascent in Plato's cave image. Sort of freeing your mind in some kind of deeper sense. It's just lack of external material obstacles. These obstacles, most notably here, being other human beings. And then the law of nature, he defines as what reason says will best conduce to peace. You realize, well, we need peace. We need all of this violence to stop. And what reason tells you will conduce to that peace? Those are laws of nature. So what are the laws of nature? Well, there's a lot of them that he gives, but the ones you really should know, most importantly, are the first three. So the first law, reason says, I should seek peace. I got to get out of here. This is terrible. Seek peace. But if you can't get peace, to use all helps and advantages of war, right? That's the first law. Second law is that we should be willing, all of us in the area, to mutually surrender our right, that is, our liberty or power to do whatever it takes to achieve our self-preservation. We should be willing to surrender that right via an agreement, what he calls a covenant, which he defines as a contract now to perform something later. That's what a covenant is. But it's significant that he uses an Old Testament term that was very big among Puritans. So he's angling for a lot of the stuff he says is might have some appeal to Puritans because of the language he uses. So he also what's the term we use today? Cultural appropriation or whatever. He's also appropriating biblical terms and giving them new meaning. So that's the second law. We should be willing to mutually agree to give up our right instead of nature to do whatever it takes to kill or be killed and so forth. We should mutually give that up by agreement. But the third law relates to a problem about any such agreement, and that is, who's to say that people are not going to break that agreement as soon as it seems like it might be in their interest to do so? And so the third law is that people must perform their covenants made, and this will mean they must be made to conform. Contracts must be enforceable. If they are not strictly enforced, people will not keep them because we're all fundamentally driven by self-interest and so forth. And this, Hobbes says, this is the basis of justice, as he puts it, the fountain and original of justice. There is no natural justice. There's no justice in the state of nature. Justice is man-made. Justice is the product of human law. And this means, well, justice is keeping your contracts. That's what justice is, period. So those are the first three laws of nature, and the ones most important to keep in mind. Now, what about the creation of this the new society that they would have to? We're going to come together. We're going to agree not to harm each other. We'll make this pact, and we'll agree to perform our covenants. But for this to happen, it needs to be enforceable. And so part of the contract will be surrendering all our rights to that guy or that group of people who will be given complete authority and all power to do whatever it takes to enforce the contracts. This person or persons are not parties to the contract. They must be above the contract. They cannot be limited in any way. They must be able to do whatever it takes. This is why he later says only the sovereigns have rights. The subjects have liberties. It's something different. Talk about that later. So the creation of the Commonwealth, it comes with this covenant to surrender rights to the ruler, right? To an absolute sovereign. You should read the full passage carefully. The full passage on page 95 of your this Norton edition of the Leviathan in chapter 17. He says, all of the people must unite their wills and essentially, it's not his language, fuse their wills into one, represented by the sovereign, so that they move as one. And they have no sort of grounds for complaint if he about how he uses that power, because they have given consent to him to have such power. So whatever he does or they do, they have authorized. Whatever he wills, they have willed indirectly. And importantly, Hobbes says tacit consent to this arrangement is enough. It doesn't have to be an explicit contract. It doesn't have to be, some moment in time where a bunch of people come together and, solemnly create some document that they sign and so forth. It's sufficient simply that you live in a commonwealth. By living there, you give your consent to following the laws of the regime. And if you don't like it, implicitly, he says it explicitly, you can get out, you can leave, you can go somewhere else, and then you're not bound to the contract because you don't live here anymore. Anyway, so defining those terms, key terms here. The Commonwealth, again, is the artificial person created by the contract, consisting of, look at the picture again, consisting of all of the people, and then of the ruler, the sovereign, who is the Leviathan, and uh, the sovereign, he says, is the carrier of the artificial person, acting on its behalf, right? And what the Leviathan means is that he is absolute sovereign, a mortal God, as he calls it, and Lord of the proud, who will put the fear of God in people, so to speak, right? But of the mortal God, into everyone to keep the covenant and all laws and stipulations pursuant thereto, right? That's what the Leviathan is. Um, you might compare this to Machiavelli's "better to be feared than loved," because you can't control whether people love you or how much they love you, but you can control whether they fear you. And this is for Hobbes. This is the only reliable way to make sure the contracts are kept. One point that I had here is this assumption that society is a kind of contract, it's based on a kind of contract, is something that Aristotle explicitly rejects in the in the Politics, and that Socrates and company in the Republic also implicitly reject. Aristotle said a contract for security is not a sufficient basis for political community. He said for a real political community, a community must be based on common values, common ideas about justice, and so forth. And that is the real basis for the community. Yes, people come together. They need to come together for security. That is part of it. But as Aristotle said, people come together for to live for living, but they stay together for living well. He said a society based on people, based on a contract would be just like an alliance among states. Something to think about. Chapter 18, Rights of the Sovereign. And I just want here to point out the conception of sovereignty involved here. Sovereignty is where the ultimate power and authority resides, and it must, in its very nature, be undivided. It's indivisible. Can't be shared or divided. Hobbes would have been very unhappy with the American founders who talked about dual sovereignty and so forth, because sovereignty means ultimate authority. And how could there be more than one ultimate authority? How could it be divided? American founders had a kind of solution for this. You can consider whether it's adequate or not. But that power is indivisible. And the other thing about this notion of sovereignty is that the sovereign has all rights, right? Everybody surrendered their rights to the sovereign. So he speaks of here of the rights of the sovereign, and later we'll speak about the liberties of the subject. Right. Okay, chapter 19 is about forms of government, and this notion of sovereignty, as Hobbes is defining it, is actually very helpful for thinking about forms of government. The form of a government is determined by where the sovereignty is, where the sovereignty lies. Right? What is the sovereign power in the government? That determines what kind of government it is. So you can compare this to Aristotle's classification of regimes. I mean, Aristotle says the same thing in a different way, but this is kind of helpful. Maybe clarification. Hobbes explicitly says there, and it sort of makes a point of saying there are only 3 forms of government. Remember, Aristotle had said there are 6 forms. There are 3 good ones, and there are 3 bad ones, right? Or there are 3 versions of good government and parallel versions of bad government. But Hobbes has rejected that kind of qualitative judgment, right, of good or bad. That's all relative to the individual. So how do you judge these forms of government? If it's not by the common good or something like that, or by its ability to achieve justice, how do you judge it? Well, it's its capacity to keep the peace, right? So the best form of government will be the one that is best able to keep the peace. And for Hobbes, that means only an absolute government, right? The problem with divided government, separation of powers and checks and balances and so forth, is it builds in conflict. And conflict is the source of disorder and potential breakdown of the order. And so, it's insane to build conflict into the government. So constitutional monarchies, mixed governments of various kinds, that will not work. Now, Hobbes acknowledges in this context the possibility that the sovereign will exploit subjects for his own self-interest. And he says this is regrettably inescapable, this problem. But it's a problem common to all governments. And anything is better than civil war and anarchy. So it's just an inconvenience you'll have to tolerate. But he goes beyond that and says, this points out the need for education of sovereigns in the duty and the rights of sovereignty. And it boils down to this. You need to teach the sovereign, and I think he has in mind, like in a monarchy, a hereditary monarchy, teaching the child who's going to be the future monarch. Teaching the sovereign that it's in his true self-interest, his long-term self-interest, not to exploit his subjects, because that will put him in jeopardy. That will threaten his self-preservation. I mean, it's notable that in Hobbes' scenario, the sovereign is in a state of nature in relation to the people. But this, because he's not party to the contract, remember? But this state of nature is tolerable because of the particular arrangement that's been made. And if the sovereign is educated into his true self-interest, his what is best, most conducive to his self-preservation, he will do exactly what Hobbes says, right? And what Hobbes says is the proper mode of rule is by law, not under the law. Important distinction, right? Rule of law means the rulers themselves are under the law. This sovereign is absolute; he's not under any law, but he should rule by law. He should do what he does by passing and executing laws, right? It's important. It's important for this peace, for order, that everybody knows what's expected of them. And so this needs to be pronounced by law. A sovereign ruling by whim is not going to create a stable regime. Um, Everybody needs to know what they're expected of, what's expected of them, and the way to do that is through laws. Um, and by the way, in chapter 26, Civil Laws, Hobbes asserts what we call legal positivism in the second paragraph. Chapter 21 on the liberty of subjects. Their liberty is their freedom. Remember, liberty means not being impeded by any external obstacles, but their freedom within the bounds of the sovereign's will. And on the one hand, this looks like not much freedom, but on the other hand, what Hobbes is saying is that as long as the sovereign doesn't say you can't do that, you can do that. And furthermore, Hobbes thinks that it's in the sovereign's own self-interest, for the sake of his own self-preservation, that he gives people plenty of room. It would be smart for him to not demand too much, especially in the private sector. The public sector is the sovereign's. He should have absolute control over the public sector. No one should question. There's no right of protest, for example, and so forth. But the sovereign, lost my train of thought. I do this in class a lot. I sort of lose my train of thought. The liberty of subjects that's what I was going to say, in the private sector is close to absolute. I mean, as long as it's kept in the private sector, as long as you don't mess with public affairs, you can do whatever you want. And so he wants a society of people, pursuing their economic interests and, painting or whatever it is they want to do, as they want to do it. He thinks that's preferable. So a kind of totalitarian system, whether this would lead to a kind of totalitarian system is another thing, but that's not what he has in mind. That's not his vision. So the subjects, well, they have a right of self-defense. This is actually the one inalienable right. I use that term, inalienable, to defend yourself against violent attack, including from the sovereign. I mean, the whole reason you joined into this contract, whether explicitly or tacitly, was for self-preservation. And so, if your self-preservation is being put in jeopardy, you have a right of nature. I mean, again, right understood not in a moral sense, but in a sense of self-interest. It's in your self-interest to resist. So, if the sovereign tries to execute you, you should try to escape. But again, you've given the sovereign so much power that you don't have much of a chance. But within the silence of the law is the biggest one. Right? If the law doesn't say, you have all the freedom you want. So I'll leave it at that for the liberty of subjects. Just a couple more chapters to cover. I know it's getting long here. Chapter 29 of the things that weaken or tend to the dissolution of a commonwealth. This chapter reads like most important principles of the ancients. Basically, everything the ancients did are things that tend to weaken or dissolve the commonwealth. But a critical point here is Hobbes says early on that the problem is getting the right system. Quote, when commonwealths come to be dissolved, not by external violence, but by intestine disorder, internal disorder, the fault is not in men as they are the matter, but as they are the makers and orderers of them. You didn't put up the right system. That's what's causing your problems. contrast that to the ancients, who said the problem is internal. Right? The problem is uh, that and that's not completely fixable, but that's where you should concentrate your efforts on cultivating a better character and so forth. We can just get the right system, all our problems will be solved. Um, so, what are some of those things? I should just quickly highlight a few. The lack of absolute power is one of them. Efforts to divide power and all these things. Um, that that tends to the destruction of the Commonwealth. Seditious doctrines, idea that the individual conscience should guide them, and idea of inspiration from God. I mean, this was big in those days. The idea that of the rule of law, that the sovereign should be restricted by law. Seditious doctrine. Um, the idea that subjects have absolute property rights. Yeah, this is all destructive to the peace and order of the Commonwealth. Um, and one way it kind of sums it up is to say our problem is that we've imitated the Greeks and the Romans, and by the Romans here, especially the Roman Church. So he says he speaks mockingly of the Greek tyrannophobia, and says that tyranny is just a word people use for sovereignty they don't like. In the conclusion, he makes that quite disconcertingly explicit. Sovereignty is tyranny. There's no real difference. Favoring a mixed government. What came out of the this idea established by the Greeks. The idea the Christian idea there's a division of sovereignty between church and state. There's an ecclesiastical authority, and there's a political authority. All of these things tend to the dissolution of a commonwealth. And how is it dissolved? Either when it's defeated by a foreign power or with civil war, which means the death of that artificial person that was created by the compact, the covenant. I hate to say this, but I think I'm going to have to make a third video here. Won't be nearly as long as this one. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to stop here for Hobbes. I want to pick up on a few things from part 4 of the Kingdom of Darkness, because this goes a little deeper into what he thinks are the causes of the problems they're having in Europe at the time. All right, thanks. Sorry for keeping so long. I'll see you later.